This is Rising Phoenix Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Rhodes. This podcast is for men struggling with an unwanted divorce. I interview experts on divorce, mental health, and I provide insights gained from my own divorce journey. You are not alone. Join me. Joining me today is psychotherapist and author Amanda Ann Gregory. Amanda, why don't we just jump right into it? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a trauma psychotherapist, which means I predominantly work with people who've experienced trauma and mostly complex trauma. And about 3 years ago, I started doing research into the concept of forgiveness and trauma recovery. And with all that research, I wrote a book called You Don't Need to Forgive, which is about sort of navigating forgiveness as a trauma survivor, a clinician working with trauma survivors. And my thesis kind of comes to forgiveness is not required in trauma recovery. It should be an elective for everyone. And there's a bunch of people who agree and some people who do not. So the book comes out in February, and it might be a little bit of a controversy.
Yeah, I think I've certainly heard both of those sort of suggestions or avenues or paths or whatever. I've had Robert Enright on the show, who's sort of the forgiveness guru. I don't know if that's the right word for him,
I
but
think that's a good way to describe Robert. Yeah.
yeah, great guy, great perspective. But before we kind of get into the debate about it, let's talk about what it is first. I always like to define things. What is, in your view, forgiveness? How do you define that?
And this could actually be the topic of a whole episode
I'm
of
sure.
defining forgiveness. One of the things I tell people is, if somebody is asking you to forgive or recommending that you forgive, ask them what forgiveness is. What definition are they using? What's your definition? Because we actually don't have a consistent definition in the field of psychology. Everybody's kind of using their own. Enright has its own. It's a great definition, but we're not all using that. So, what are we speaking to? So, when I talk about forgiveness, I think it's beneficial to first go through what it's not, because
Okay.
I think in the research, people actually agree to more what forgiveness isn't before they could actually get on the same page of what it is. So some of the things that forgiveness has been confused with are things like forgetting, which it's not. Sort of the term forgive and forget doesn't make a whole lot of sense because we still have the memory of what happened, and we're allowed to have that memory. So forgiveness isn't amnesia by any means. Forgiveness isn't rationalizing or excusing or justifying someone's behavior. Those are different. Those might be coping mechanisms, those might be obstacles that we come across, but that's not forgiveness. Forgiveness also isn't condoning their behavior or pardoning anything. Forgiveness isn't in denial. So we're fully aware of what happened and how we feel. So forgiveness is not denial at all. Forgiveness also isn't acceptance, which some people get them confused. So as acceptance is more, I completely understand that I went through this thing. It happened. It's not going to change. I'm continuing to go forward, but you can actually experience acceptance without forgiveness. And one thing I make sure everybody know is that forgiveness is not a trauma response, which it can be in some situations. Now, that's probably not going to be genuine forgiveness, but
Yeah.
sometimes we will verbalize forgiveness in order to stay safe, so that is not genuine forgiveness. And so when I sort of define forgiveness, I believe forgiveness is really on a continuum
Hmm.
of emotions. So, and this is kind of where I'm very similar with Enright. So you have one end of the continuum that could be utter vengeance and hate, and the other end that could be love. And so I feel that forgiveness really lies upon that continuum of which the emotions can sway more in the direction of neutral or positive. But I don't believe you need to end up at love to forgive. I believe forgiveness can be a decision that one makes, but also an openness to experiencing it. So a level of just receptiveness. And I say that because there are many people who have been against forgiveness, didn't want to forgive, and then one day they do. And it's organic. And so I feel like sometimes we can forgive, maybe not making this one cognitive decision, but just being open to the process. So forgiveness is an emotional process. It's very rarely this decision of I'm going to forgive and then bam, I've forgiven and I'm fine. And we usually do see a reduction in like negative thoughts, emotions, behaviors towards the offender, and an increase in positive ones. And I think forgiveness can involve conditions of the offender, depending upon what the forgiver needs. But I do believe ultimately it is unconditional. So forgiveness is something that we go through, that's our own experience. It doesn't need to involve our offender, and especially if our offender has been abusive.
Yeah, wow, there's a lot there. Yeah, clearly there. I mean, it's complicated, right? It's complex. I want it to be simple, like most things, right? It's easier for my my silly ass brain here to compute it if it's easy and simple, but it's not. Um, One of the things that, and probably because I put it in the outline that I didn't hear you say, which is something that I struggled with in some ways, is reconciliation, forgiveness, sort of equaling reconciliation, and I think obviously this is more around a divorce, a relationship type of situation, or maybe relationship being also parent child, I suppose. Um, what how does is that a common thing, mistake, maybe, I don't know if that's the right word, that people make, assuming that if you forgive you have to at least attempt to reconcile or attempt to reconnect with that person?
Yes, that is so common. That is probably one of the most common misconceptions. And it's kind of scary if you think about it. If you're wanting to forgive or someone's asking you to forgive and you're perceiving that as, well, I need to reconcile with
Right.
this person. I need to make up with them. They need to be part of my life. That's
Right.
that's horrible. And so no, forgiveness is not reconciliation. In fact, we can reconcile with someone without forgiving them, and we can forgive without reconciling. So those two do not need to happen hand in hand. Now sometimes they do, but they don't have to.
Hmm. I've never sort of heard of reconciling but not forgiving. I would assume that if you did, but I guess that makes sense. I mean, I guess people hold on to their anger and their bitterness and their hurt, justifiably so, and still reconcile. And then I think that usually leads to another. And I'm talking again, uh, more. Well, I guess parent child too. My mom and I, like, seems like every couple of years it's like, I'm done with you, and then it's like, all right, I guess I forgive you, and let's try this again. Um, but I guess it is probably more common than I would think. Um, So it sounds like you're making an awful big case for forgiving, from what I'm hearing so far. Um, but let's move on. We'll get to sort of your theory in the book for sure. Um, and this is one that I think, well, maybe we'll skip a little bit. So if you were to forgive, what could that give you? What are the things that, or that is shown in sort of in any studies or anything of that nature that does come from forgiving someone for wronging you?
Sure. So if forgiveness is what you need, if it's on your recovery table, if it's a
Mm,
part of your journey, that can bring you a lot of relief. It can bring you great emotional relief, physical relief. We do have quite a few studies that show a positive relationship between forgiveness and mental health and physical health. With that, I always tell people there's a caveat. Very few of those studies are with trauma survivors. So it's
mm,
good to be aware of that. And those that are, they're really flawed. There's a lot of limitations to that. And so I never want to tell anybody, forgive, you'll feel better.
right,
Or
right.
I read an article recently and the title was Forgive, Your Life Depends on It. Like, wow, that's dramatic. Because it doesn't work for everybody and it's not what everyone needs. So I always remind people, is there evidence that forgiveness can be helpful? Absolutely. Does that mean it's going to help you? No. Does that mean it's a panacea? No, it doesn't.
So then, I mean, I guess that leads to the question, which is sort of how we can sort of start bringing up your book is do you have to forgive? Actually, let me, because I think you brought up a really important point there. But sorry, it just hit me that I did want to bring this up and I forgot. And we'll come back to that big question, and I'll go over it again. But in terms of forgiveness, like in what you have seen and what the studies have been conducted, is there a different type of forgiveness? In other words, or are the actions perpetrated against someone cause differences in the types of forgiveness? So in other words, someone
Mhm.
raping someone, someone killing a family member, a divorce, being cheated on, being beaten as a kid. Does that change? Do the studies look at the differences between why someone would need to forgive? And then if so, is there anything that has been reflected in terms of like it depending on what was done to you determines the type of forgiveness or the path of forgiveness or the need for forgiveness even?
Right, they really don't. The forgiveness studies really just kind of cluster people together in
Mm,
general groups, and when they work with people who've experienced some horrific things, very small studies, very lots of white people in the
mm,
studies, so not really kind of diverse, lots of women, lots of Midwestern people,
mm.
and so Midwestern people were a little different, and so we want to kind of look at that when it comes to forgiveness, but. I mean, I like where you're going with this of, even different types of forgiveness, but no, we're not there. It's
Mm,
usually you forgive or you don't. Pick a
mm,
side. It just feels very sort of black and white and even defining forgiveness at times. And, with this, I think when we go through something that, for example, if someone calls me a name on one occasion versus if they abused me as a child, my entire childhood,
right.
I think that's a difference in the actual process
Mm,
of forgiveness. And so I think what we might be looking at is different processes, might take longer. It might be a lot more emotional processing from one side or the other. And so I think absolutely what the experience was, what the wrong or wrongs were, does impact the process. But as far as types of forgiveness, I haven't really seen it laid out like that. Like, for example, mild forgiveness, moderate
right, right, right,
forgiveness,
right, right,
severe forgiveness, things like
right.
that.
Okay, so and I assume that that's the case because there's so many things that could happen to a person. So of course that to look at every single one is probably a difficult task. I imagine to look at it in general sounds like it's not a focus. But okay, so back to the big sort of question at hand, and I think this will all also lead to many other questions. But do you have to forgive? Is it something that is necessary?
No, you don't need to forgive. You really don't. So here's kind of where I sort of came to this. So as a trauma psychotherapist and a trauma survivor myself, I always had this question about forgiveness. Is it required? Is it not? And so I started asking a lot of my colleagues doing the research, and I could not get a clear answer. Like no one could give me a clear answer. And if they could, they were on one end or the other.
Hmm.
And it was very confusing. But in my own work, what I started to do is take forgiveness off the table in trauma recovery. Don't say don't forgive. No, because I am not anti forgiveness at all. If forgiveness needs to be on your table, let's put it there. Let's address that. But if it doesn't, it doesn't. And what I noticed is trauma survivors, once it was off the table, once it was optional, some of them just forgave
Hmm.
in the work that they did. And these were some people that are like, no, I'm absolutely not going to forgive. But a lot of these folks have experiences where they were pressured to forgive or they were encouraged to forgive. And there's a lot of things that happen with trauma survivors that can make it really difficult to forgive, but then they couldn't and then they were shamed. And
Hmm.
so then you bring up forgiveness and it's this obstacle.
Hmm.
But if you take the obstacle away, some people forgive and some people don't. Now here's the caveat. The people who I noticed didn't forgive still made progress.
Hmm.
So it wasn't this thing that you need to go through. You need
Right.
to forgive in order to recover. I just didn't see it.
Hmm. How do you know that it's besides just emotion and a feeling? How do you know that you don't? Let's say you're me and you went through a divorce and it fucking sucked and you still have troubles on occasion, even though it's been over 5 years because of children. Excuse me, because of children, finances, all kinds of stuff, right? I mean, it's a total turning upside down in your life. How would I know if after 5.5 years, let's say I hadn't forgiven, and I don't know, I think it is a continuum. And today, yeah, probably forgive. Tomorrow, I don't know. You have to ask me tomorrow. let's say though I'm having one of those days where it's like I do not forgive. How do I know that and I put pressure on myself to like I really need to, or I shame myself because today I'm not, and I should, but I already did, and I should have. How do I know that I need to sort of let that go and um not shame myself or not beat myself up for not forgiving? How do I know if that's the path I should take?
And I would really suggest in those moments, when you're noticing you're having those motions or the days that you feel like you're not forgiving, let yourself feel it. Like maybe just take that pressure or that result of forgiveness away and just let yourself feel it. And I tell people, think of the process of forgiving or other many different emotional processes like grieving. Does anybody ever say you should be done grieving? Hopefully not. Hopefully they're
Right.
not saying that, because we can be grieving a loss that happened years and years ago, but then an anniversary comes up, a holiday comes up, right? And we have these different feelings, and that can last for a day or a week or a month. But grieving is such a fluid emotional process. And the best you can do is go through it as opposed to around it. So, if you go through a horrific, and divorce absolutely can be traumatic,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. And yet, if there's this day where you're feeling just this anger, towards your ex, and then that pressure comes from yourself, or honestly, a lot of times society, of you need to forgive, you need to move on. Or the things that really kill me is that when they go after the forgiver with things like, you know, if you don't forgive, it's like drinking poison.
Yeah.
You need to let go. You
Right.
need to feel better. It's like, ouch, now you're now you're coming after me.
Right. Yeah. I always in the big. I will say I've made a lot of progress, and I want to get to something you just said a few minutes ago. I've done a lot of work, and in the beginning, though, I hated that shit. That anger is like drinking a poison and expecting to go fuck yourself. That's kind of what I
Yeah.
feel. But I was very bitter and very angry. But I hated those because it is a pressure that I think is a bit unnecessary. It's doesn't it. I do think there is good in forgiveness, but I think that if that's something that's thrust upon you initially and throughout, it can be very, like you said, it can build this shame that comes when when you can't get there, or the thought of it even makes you angry, and then you feel like it reinforces, especially if you went through a divorce, because it reinforces, well, if it was unwanted, I'm not a good person, or here, see, I can't even forgive, I'm such a piece of shit.
Yeah.
um I want to go back to, because I can relate to this a little bit, in terms of, you said that the people that took forgiveness off the table, the work they did led to them actually forgiving. What is that work? And I know that's probably very nebulous and maybe not completely fair, but what is work that can lead to it, unintentional?
Right. And so it's really kind of what I observed is going through. And so in trauma recovery, there's so many different methods, so many different things to do, and different things work for different people. So there's not
Sure.
just one way, just like forgiveness is not one way. But typically in trauma recovery, there's things that come up a lot. So there's safety, developing a sense of felt safety. So actual safety, which is I can look around, I'm safe, I know I'm safe, but a felt sense of safety in trauma recovery is required. And so a lot of the work could be building that up. If it's increase my support system, if I feel safe with a therapist, if I, just feeling safe to really do the work. And then there's a ton of emotional processing. And when I say processing, I'm saying emotions that move, they change, body sensations that change. There's a lot of that. And some of that space is with anger and rage
Mm.
and revenge fantasies and all these things that some people are afraid of. But as trauma therapists, you can't be afraid of that because it happens all the time. And so moving through that, and anger can turn into grief in a second.
Mm-hmm.
If we take that pressure off people of calm down, don't be angry, don't drink the poison. If we just let them be angry in a safe space and don't judge them, sometimes in 2 minutes now they're crying
Mm.
and they're processing the grief, because finally they feel safe to do that. So it's a ton of emotional processing. And also, especially in trauma recovery, it's addressing the shame, because that's there usually, especially with complex trauma, in some degree. And so, it's really building up that self-worth, challenging those beliefs about myself. If it's I'm a piece of shit or I'm a failure, I'm not good enough, really changing those not into positive beliefs, because I'm not a big believer in positive psychology.
Hmm.
It's more updating them to present moment in time that are more realistic. So instead of believing I'm not good enough, we don't need to believe I'm a perfect person. That's not even true.
Right.
Or I'm great. No, let's not do that. How about I'm simply good enough? How about I'm a decent human being? Can we just go there? And so there's a lot of elements to it, but people who do this work, if you see, if we make forgiveness elective, forgiveness could pop up at any point in this recovery journey, like any point it can come. And sometimes it can even come at the end when people aren't anticipating it. And sometimes it never comes up.
Hmm.
Sometimes people will end up in a place with their offender where they might say, you know what, I don't consider them a human being. I really don't. I don't wish them
Hmm.
anything good, but yeah, I don't really think about them anymore. Like it's very rare. I do feel this release. I'm experiencing this acceptance. Is that success? Yeah, I would call that success. Some people would say no. Some people would say they have to forgive. You
Right.
have to do that last step. But I'm just not a believer in that.
Yeah. I don't disagree. I think again, I think there's benefit, but I agree if it's ultimately holding you back in some kind of way, that pressure or expectation or whatever. I do see your point, and I don't think that you're wrong. I want to talk about a couple of things in terms of processing. Um, if we could get a little bit more nuance there, but also something that always comes up when I have these conversations about sort of dealing with trauma, and of course the great book, The Body Keeps the Score, like that
Classic.
topic seems to come up anytime I have these types of discussions. And for me, it's a bit abstract. I kind of understand it. I do try to listen to my body, but I feel very disconnected from it for a lot of trauma when I was very little. So that's probably why I lost disconnection to some of those systems, those nerve systems. But uh, if how important, let's start with there. How important is the body in terms of recovery or even the process of getting through trauma?
It's very important. And to really sort of validate what you said, it's probably the biggest pain in the ass of some of my clients.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I myself been through complex childhood trauma that I have a knack for disassociation.
Oh
I
yeah,
can
me
do it on
too.
a dime.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's my thing. Yeah,
I'm so good at it. And I
yeah,
always tell my clients, look, trauma responses, coping mechanisms are not bad. Okay. They were there to keep you safe, to keep you sane. They may not be working now. And that's the issue, but they're not bad. And so, absolutely, the body is a big part of that. And so, work on, first of all, kind of reconnecting with the body in a way that feels safe.
yeah.
Because if you've been disconnected from your body for a long period of time, you get back in there, you're noticing things that doesn't feel safe.
Yeah.
And when we go into that emotional processing, emotions are the body. It's the same thing. Emotions really don't have language. When we have an emotion, we're using the front of our brain to create a word that best describes that. But sometimes in emotional processing, people can't tell you how they feel because it has no language. The language of emotions is physical responses. And so if someone is doing a lot of processing and they feel something in their chest and they just notice that and they're working through that, that's actually better than telling me it feels like pressure, it feels like, anger. It's like, well, no, we're already there. We don't even need to label it. And I think what's really tough about trauma is that it exists in different parts of our brains that we usually don't have intentional access to. And that's what makes it really tough. And so, as a trauma therapist, I've got to use a lot of bottom up methods that some of my clients call black magic or voodoo,
Hmm.
because it's not like that talk therapy, but I've got to access the brainstem, the midbrain, because the prefrontal cortex isn't helping me out a lot when it comes to trauma. Now, at the end of the day, it will in all the processing, but the body is huge in this work, but it could also be really scary.
Yeah, I mean, so many things come up with that. I was just thinking about the anxiety I've experienced over the last 2-ish years. And again, she left 5 and change ago, 5 and 4 months or whatever it's been. With the last 2.5 years, roughly, no, about 2 years, I have had panic attacks. I've
Mm.
had just panic, period, anxiety, just very high from things that I never really had before. Flying on an airplane, never had a problem in my life, and flown a lot. The last 2 years, I have to make sure I got an aisle seat, and if I don't, I really got to do so, and even sometimes then, but I really got to do exercises to like make sure I don't freak the fuck out and make them land a plane. I need to get off, land a plane, or I'm getting off. You can't even take off. I'm getting off. And so that just it kind of hit me that when you said it, about when you do sort of start working on dropping into your body, that it can feel scary. And now it made me think, I wonder if there's because I would say the last, 2.5-ish years is when I've really started to try and get into my body. And I wonder how much of this is correlation. I don't know. Maybe I'm grasping at straws here. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it could be. And when people are connecting with their body or working through trauma or just emotions in their body, it doesn't even need to be trauma. It could just be emotional sensations. There does need to be sort of this balance of connecting, doing the work, but also with that safety.
Mm.
So, learning certain skills, learning certain ways that you can calm your system down fast, you can redirect, just do whatever you need to do. That does need to be a part of it, because if not, sometimes in this work, we kind of help clients reconnect and then they're just sort of lost in the wilderness, and it's like, I'll see you back next week. You're lost in the wilderness in your
Right.
body. So we don't want to do that. So there definitely needs to be sort of a combination, because I feel like in doing this work, again, there needs to be that feeling of safety. If I'm going to connect with my body and really feel it, I need to know, okay, if that ever feels overwhelming, what can I do
Mm.
to calm? What can I do to get to a state where I feel safer?
Yeah, I mean, there's a self-soothing aspect, right? That you sort of, at least for myself, because of early childhood stuff, that was not a skill that I had. At least I could find ways to get through, right? Disassociation, but I wouldn't call that soothing in a way. But I think that is part of this too, is learning the tools that are necessary to soothe yourself uh, when you're dealing with these emotions. Um, I know that's something that I initially, for sure, because it was so overwhelming, I really struggled with. I could not soothe myself. I'd have to call somebody and talk for 2 hours
Mm-hmm.
about how unfair and unjust and this was and all that. But let's back up to processing a little bit. Let's say again, if it was me and I'm coming to you with a feeling of failure because I am getting a divorce and I'm a failure, and that's the message I'm telling myself over and over. I'm spiraling and there's no hope, there's no future. How do you process that? Like, what are and I know there are different methods, but let's just take a basic case of a man in his mid 40s who is feeling the feelings that I felt. How do you start to process that? How do you determine which methodology that you might use?
And so with that, and after safety has been created and all of that, sometimes it's definitely determined by the client.
Mm.
I have people come to me that know that I do certain modalities, interventions. They're like, I want to try that. I'm like, let's try it. Let's see. And usually the clients that I get with complex trauma have been through the other methods, have been through the
Mm.
CBT and all these things, all the cognitive methods. And so
Yeah.
they are coming for something different. So in my work, sometimes it's chosen by the client, sometimes we choose it together. And
Gotcha.
so with that, like for example, if we were doing EMDR, I would want to know, when was the first time in your life when you noticed you started to believe you're a failure?
Mm.
And I may guess it was before the divorce,
Oh yeah.
possibly. And so that's where we would go, actually. Like, we might actually work more on your childhood
Mm-hmm.
than the divorce, because what happens is that when we work on that and get that processing through, sometimes you come back and think about the divorce and it feels very different.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the method, kind of going back earlier. If we were doing things like somatic therapies, it
Mm-hmm.
may be, you know, connecting with feeling like a failure. And where's that in your body? Where do you feel that? Where do you notice that? Can we help that sensation to integrate, and move along? If it was IFS or internal family systems, we would want to look at the parts of you, right? Which
Yeah.
part of you believes like you're a failure? I might even ask, what if that part couldn't believe that anymore? What would happen? What would be, yeah. So lots
Yeah.
of different methods to
Yeah,
use. Yeah, but I would, yeah,
I think I've done. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I think but when you said IFS, I was like, oh yeah, I'm doing that now. I think I've done them
yes,
all myself personally. So, um, and I think it speaks to a couple things. One is yes, everyone is different, right? And so what works for one might not work for the other. That's why I've tried to. I haven't had anyone about IFS on here, but I've had different modalities, narrative therapy being one of them, off the top of my head. So it speaks to that. I think it reinforces that everyone is different, and it also I think reinforces that you need to get to the sort of mentality that I'm just gonna try stuff. I'm just gonna
yeah,
try some stuff and keep trying something until I find something that works, and maybe have to go back to some things. But if you're working with someone and they're trying a particular thing and it's not working, how do you know? And what kind of a time frame do you give someone to? I mean, obviously, it's probably from feedback and stuff, but like, at what point is it like, okay, this is not working? Is it a month? Is it a week? Is it a year? Like, what's the general?
yeah. It really depends on the method and it depends on what's working on. So if I have a client and we're working on really developing that safety, I'm not going to really expect them to be doing the trauma processing or looking at that. What I'd be looking at is, are they feeling safer? Do I have any evidence, that this is working? Let's say a client feels safe. We're into the nitty gritty, just horrific, messy trauma processing. I'm going to be looking at, is there movement? And that could be so many different ways to measure that, but I want to see movement. um Honestly, I wouldn't wait long, especially with some modalities like EMDR. Now granted, there is a misconception that EMDR, you go in there for 12 sessions and you're great.
Right.
Not for complex trauma. Let me just dispel that right now.
Yeah.
Not true. But there are certain ways to measure it, of is movement happening. So if I'm working on, let's say, a memory or a childhood or light or a belief with a client, and we're working on it a few times and I'm not seeing any movement, I'm not seeing any shift, I can definitely throw in some more interventions. But yeah, it's going to get to the point where I'm going to have a conversation with the client about, hey, this is what I'm seeing. What are you experiencing? What's your plan? Do we need to make alterations? Do I need to refer you
Mm.
to another clinician? But absolutely, I'm going to want to be seeing some movement, because if not, then we've got what, months and months and months. Then it turns into years of we're working on the same thing. I mean, that's an ethical issue right there.
Yeah. I want to cover two things, and then we'll dive in a little bit into the book. You talked about getting into the midbrain. I've never heard of that. I've heard of wanting to get into the prefrontal cortex so you can get out of fight or flight, essentially. But it sounds like trauma lies in midbrain. A, was that true? That's my interpretation of what you said. B, what the hell is the midbrain? What goes on there?
Yeah, so I keep the neurobiology really simple because frankly, I get bored with it.
Yeah.
I'm not big
Right.
into like neurosciences and this. It's just not my thing.
Yeah.
So I always tell people, just think of three parts of your brain. Okay. So you got the prefrontal cortex, which is the part in the front, logic, reason, problem solving. That's your adult brain. And then you've got the midbrain, which is kind of right in the center, and that's all the emotions. And that's typically where trauma is stored, but also the brain stem is where it's. So we got two back sections of
Hmm.
the brain here where trauma is stored. Now, remember, we can go through some horrific stuff and never develop trauma.
Hmm.
It can happen. There is a natural process that our brain does, and this is why not everybody develops trauma. But when trauma occurs, it is usually, I tell people, it's stuck. It's stuck in your midbrain, your brain stem. And going to the prefrontal cortex is a great way to manage trauma responses. But when you're doing that trauma work, you got to go back into the brain and stick there for a while. And some of these interventions will actually push it up to the prefrontal cortex where it can be analyzed and integrated. For example, if you bring up the I'm a failure belief. So I'm a failure belief is not in your prefrontal cortex, because that is a belief that is all or nothing. That means you're a failure every single situation. You're a failure as a human being, right? So there's not a lot of flexibility there. But if that belief becomes changed, it becomes a bit more flexible, a bit more up to date, a bit more logical. And we would know that because then that would be in your prefrontal cortex. Like, for example, you might be saying, you know what, I'm successful at this, this, and that. And I'm pretty decent at this, this, and that. I'm not good at that. that's a lot more variety
Sure.
and a lot fair than
Yeah.
just I'm a failure.
So how do you get stuff from the midbrain to the prefrontal cortex?
Depends on the method. And
Hmm.
so if it's EMDR, it's going to be accessing what's back there, really leaning into it and allowing the brain to organically reprocess that and integrate it. If it's IFS, it's doing the same thing, maybe more verbally. If it's in the body, we're going to be noticing those body sensations. So imagine we're walking towards it, we're
Hmm.
leaning into it. And then it's almost like we're taking trauma by the hand and trying to walk it to the prefrontal cortex. That's kind of what it looks like sometimes, but you have to go through it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the tough thing, because
Oh
when
yeah.
we get back there, then we're there. And the whole point of safety is we want to feel safe enough to do that work. We want to have one foot in the present, one foot in the past, so we're not completely in the past. It's a balancing game the entire time. It really is. But when you see it happening, it's beautiful.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
can
you can
imagine.
just see the system, working itself out. And a lot of times this happens unverbally, where I can look at someone's body and just see it being integrated. Like I can see shoulders just come down, and then just like these sensations leave someone's body. And I'm sitting there watching it in awe. And I'm like, wow, I wonder how they're going to feel now. I wonder what their life's going to be like now. And there's bits and pieces of that throughout recovery. Sometimes do we have aha moments? Sure, absolutely they occur. But I always tell people, don't look for those, because in trauma recovery, it's these small organic moments that add up over a period of time.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's just the whole process. I mean, I've seen men like go from not in a therapy context necessarily, or when I'm not a therapist. I mean, I was a coach for a bit, but I've seen guys grow, and it is pretty fucking amazing, which gives hope and makes things makes me feel yeah, good for lack of a better word. Because it shows that it's possible to recover from really devastating stuff.
Yeah.
Um, I want to touch on one more thing, and then we'll dive into the book a little bit. Um, what are some things that guys can do outside of a therapist's office that are beneficial? I know for me, journaling has been helpful. I'm not always the best at it, but that's, I it's a part of my life, but it's not like I don't center my life around it. But it has been helpful. What are some of those types of things? Are there? Is that the thing? Are there any other things that people can do to sort of work outside of just the therapist's office?
Yes, and I always tell people, remember, one size doesn't fit all
Yeah,
with any method that you use, and one thing isn't going to work for everybody.
sure.
I tell people that we do not have the research that says that one thing is going to work for you. So yoga could be great, but it may not work for you. Meditation could be great, but it may not work for you. So it's all about finding a couple of things. I always tell people at least a couple of things that help you process. It could be writing. It could be walking. Walking is actually EMDR, back for like the bilateral stimulation. What That's why when people go for walks, they'll be like,
Huh.
oh, and then I have a clear head. Or then I think there's so some people simply walking, some people that's not enough. They got to walk in nature, or by water, or immerse themselves in water. So when I'm trying to help clients find out what works for them, I'll usually ask what's already working, or what do they do and not know why they do it,
Hmm.
and can we use that in a really healthy way in their processing. One thing I am a bit of a stickler on, but this is because we have the research behind it, and I've experienced this with my clients myself. If you have a good support system, you tend to do better.
Hmm. Yeah, I believe that.
So that's
See
just,
it.
it's with the attachment model, it's with sort of feeling safe. And so I always assess people of who's in your life.
Hmm.
Do you feel safe with them? Yeah. Can you be vulnerable with them? If not, can we bring some of those people in? Can we kind of create that safety and support? And it doesn't need to be always with people. Animals are a big part of trauma recovery. Pets, these beings that you already are attached to. And so really, I think it's about finding a couple of methods that work for you. And if you don't know, try some things out,
Yeah.
and try some things out that you think may not work. Like I worked with a guy once, and it was dance,
Hmm.
and he was like, he didn't realize it, but just moving his body really helped him. work through these. And he didn't even dance before. It was just something that he stumbled upon.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think back to the earlier point, it really is a mindset of let's just try some stuff. Let's not stay stagnant. And that's a whole other conversation. There's so many things that we talked about that could be expanded into our entire episodes. But let's get back to the original topic, which is forgiveness and your book. I guess I want to ask a couple things. One is, what's the main sort of topic? Obviously, forgiveness, but what's the little bit more nuance to that? And then, if who would this be for? If you had a pitch to some like this is the target audience. Who would those? So those kind of two questions about the book, and then of course when's it coming out and all that kind of good stuff.
Right. So this book is really written for trauma survivors, their clinicians, and their loved ones. So if you're a trauma survivor and you've butted up against forgiveness, or you're thinking about forgiveness, or you're not sure, this would be great to read. Clinicians, I would love clinicians to read this book, because whenever I talk to clinicians about forgiveness, they just don't know. And I don't expect them to know. I didn't know. So we all have different definitions. We're not sure what we're recommending or not recommending. Right. So this would be great for the and loved ones, because I think there's a lot of things in this book about why safety is needed, the impact of shame, the impact of even social justice and forgiveness in the therapeutic space, that I think loved ones would be great for them to read. I think I would love for forgiveness advocates to read it, just to have a different take, because I actually have a whole chapter about forgiveness advocates and how to respond to them. And most of the time, they are advocating for forgiveness to help. They want to be helpful, but sometimes they're not. And I think that would be really great for them to hear of, hey, how can I help better? How can I help in a way that can really support this person? I also have kind of what we were talking about, a bunch of different trauma treatment strategies in the book too. Nice. Because as I was writing it, I was thinking, okay, so the book is about how you don't have to forgive, but then what do people do instead? Right. If they're not going to forgive. So I do include that, in the book. So I think it's just a great resource. It's not something that's out there, because I looked, all the books out there on forgiveness are, you need to forgive. This is how you forgive. Yeah. So there's not sort of a different mindset of, hey, you may not need to forgive, and that's okay. Here's some other things to think about, or here's how to talk to people if they, pressure forgiveness upon you. So it comes out February 25th, 2025. So we've got a little bit, but yeah, I'm just hoping it kind of gets to the people who need to read it.
And how can people find it? I'm assuming probably Amazon. Is it all?
Oh yeah, it's going to be out there. Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's pretty simple. You don't need to forgive. Sometimes I mess up my own title and I say you don't have to forgive, and I'm like, damn it, that's not good branding. you don't need to forgive.
And then how can people find you? I mean, obviously, like, I think I've said this 160 some episodes. I probably said it about 120 times. I found you on psychologytoday.com. Is there another way for people to find you?
Yeah, just go to my direct website. It's got all my stuff on there, links to the book, but also I've got a lot of free resources for trauma survivors. I tend to write a lot about topics that I think are really not kind of spoken about. So for example, I have a blog about how deep breathing could actually aggravate trauma responses, which we don't hear about a lot. Yeah. So on my website, it's just Amanda Ann Gregory.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, Amanda, thank you so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Thank you so much for watching and or listening. If you are feeling alone on this journey, please join our Discord server. Becoming a Phoenix is not a solitary act. It is one achieved through community. Our Discord server is just that, a community of men fighting to survive, thrive, and rise from their divorce. Go to risingphoenixpodcast.com/Discord for information on how to join and what is contained in our Discord server. Please join us.